Welcome to Week 8, Part 1. This week we're going to be looking at the global revolution of the 20th and 21st centuries. The world of the 20th century experienced warfare and distress unparalleled in history. Nothing seemed to be the same anymore. Some people became disenchanted and disgruntled, questioning the rationality and logic of the world. And this questioning by artists and writers and philosophers and scientists began even in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And is expressed very well in this 1907 painting by the Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, who represented Cubism in art. Picasso didn't look at the world like artists had done so before him. He didn't look at it through a unified perspective. Instead, he looked at it from many different perspectives, many viewpoints. Some of those perspectives were fragmented, some distorted, some geometrical, all of them unconventional, that is, not logical or not rational. Sometimes they were meant to be whimsical. And then, of course, it wasn't only the perspective of the artist, it would be the perspective of the audience, of you and I viewing the painting. What about our ideas? What about our perspectives? How do we see things related? You see, everything was beginning to be seen as relative in life, not necessarily as absolute. Let's look at the story of how that begins to happen. First of all, I put together a fun little program here for you to show you some of the major technological changes that took place. In 1941, the world's first operational computer using binary arithmetic developed. In 1957, Soviet Sputnik became the first spacecraft to orbit the Earth. In 1958, the silicon chip was invented. In 1962, the first communication satellite was launched. In the 1960s, the U.S. military developed ARPANET to link military and government computers in case of a nuclear war. In 1971, the first coin-operated computer game was developed, the ancestor of today's video games. In the 1970s, Sony's Betamax and JVC's VHS launched the first mass-market videos. In 1981, the first IBM personal computer was introduced. In 1983, ARPANET was merged with University Links to establish the Internet. In 1989, the World Wide Web was developed. And last, in 1997, mass retail sales of DVD titles and players began. Well, let's look a little bit about how science changed significantly as well. In the 1880s, a man in Vienna, Austria, by the name of Sigmund Freud, developed psychoanalysis. Freud believed very much in the power of the subconscious mind. And there in the subconscious mind, things were not always the way they appear on the outside. Again, showing that things can be relative with personalities and individuals. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays that would change forever the way medicine was practiced. So too, the year later, would be the invention of the sphygmomanometer to measure blood pressure. Chemistry took a leap in 1897 when J.J. Thomson discovered electrons. And the husband and wife, Marie and Pierre Curie, discovered radium, that is, a radioactive element, in the following year. 1903, from Dayton, Ohio, came Orville and Wilbur Wright, who made the world's first controlled, powered, manned flight. And in 1905, Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity, followed 10 years later by his general theory of relativity in 1915. With his theory of relativity, notice theory of relativity, Einstein said that mass, energy, and movement are interchangeable. His equation, E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, demonstrated that. And demonstrated how a very small mass can sometimes produce an enormous amount of energy. According to Einstein, there was no such thing as absolute time. The speed of light, however, was absolute. In fact, the speed of light is always the same, whether you're going towards it or away from it. But time is not absolute. Time and space are relative. All measurements are relative. Time is, in essence, a fourth dimension. In 1908, Henry Ford developed the first mass-produced automobile, the Ford Model T. And as they used to laugh, you could have it in any color you wanted as long as it was black, because that's the only model they made. In 1919, Ernest Rutherford, again, would increase our knowledge of chemistry with his discovery of the proton. 1921, Charles Best and Frederick Banting used insulin to save a diabetic dog. And in 1929, British bacteriologist Alexander Fleming published the results of his experiments with a bread mold, penicillin, which killed bacteria. No one paid too much attention until the 1940s, when penicillin was rediscovered and used as an antibiotic. In 1932, chemistry changed again as James Chadwick discovered the neutron. Medicine changed in the 1930s with the discovery of sulfa drugs. And the world changed forever in 1945 with Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, which exploded the first atomic bomb. The transistor was invented in 1948, leading to small radios, transistor radios, which Dr. Tenkate and all his friends owned and thought they were very cool to have. In 1953, English physicist Francis Crick and American biochemist James Watson discovered the structure of the DNA molecule, a double helix. In 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine using a dead virus of polio. In 1957, Dr. Albert Sabin of Cincinnati developed a polio vaccine that used a live weakened virus. In 1964, there was the first heart transplant on a human. 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in the US's Apollo 11. 1978, the first test tube baby was born. 1982, the first artificial heart. 1996, the first adult mammal, a sheep called Dolly, was cloned. And in 2003, we finished mapping and sequencing the human genes, that is, the Human Genome Project. Well, now as we begin to look at how this world all came about, let's start with Europe. And let's start with Europe in closer to the present day with the European Union. And then we'll look at the Cold War in Europe, and then we'll look at the Cold War in Asia and several other places. The EC, the European Community, also known as the Common Market, was founded in 1957 to foster economic cooperation between the free market economies of Western Europe. The EEC was later renamed the EC, European Communities, then simplified to the European Community, and since a conference at Maastricht in Holland in 1991, it has been called the EU, that is, the European Union. The EU is headed by the European Parliament, which meets alternately in Luxembourg and in Strasbourg, France. On January 1st, 1993, a single market without internal customs and without passport checks began between EU members. And on November of that year, Germany became the 12th and final member to ratify the Maastricht treaties. So, basically they were eliminating, it would be possible now, and as of 1993, for goods, money, and people to travel freely between what was then 15 members of the EU. That is because tariffs and customs barriers were eliminated. On January 1st of 1999, the EMU, the European Monetary Union, was launched. And then of the 15 members, 11 of them joined the monetary union with a single currency called the euro. The United Kingdom did not join the monetary union and is still not a member of the monetary portion of the union. In 2002, the EU nations' individual currencies were dropped, so they were no longer going to print marks, for instance, and new euro notes and coins were issued. Monetary policy is directed by the new European Central Bank, which sets interest and exchange rates. And in 2007, 2 more nations joined the EU. There are now 27 nations in the EU. An important thing to look at is the GDP, the gross domestic product, which really measures the wealth of countries. Let's go ahead and look at this from the CIA's World Factbook, which gives 2012 estimates of the largest economies in the world. Taken as a total, the European Union, which is one economy, is the world's largest economy. The United States is running a close second. China is third. India, Japan, Germany, Russia, Brazil, etc. Notice more and more Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, Iran, etc., Argentina, Saudi Arabia. So you can see that more and more countries in South America and the Middle East and in Asia are joining the ranks of the wealthy nations. And again, we have to be careful when we say wealthy because, the United States has a little bit over 300 million people in this kind of GDP, where China has over 1.2 billion people, 4 times the number of people, and a smaller GDP. So again, things are all kind of relative. Well, we're going to look at the end of World War II, and if you recall, we had stated that it was determined that after the war was over, that French and British and the U.S. and the Soviet Union were going to position themselves and oversee areas based upon where their troops were at that time period. And so the Soviet Union's troops were stationed largely in Eastern Europe. And so the Cold War will develop with the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and its Soviet bloc of nations, which would become members of the Warsaw Pact, which was an alliance, versus the United States and its democratic and capitalist allies in Western Europe, which would become part of NATO. You can even see that this applied to Germany, which was divided into 4 zones: a British zone, a French zone, American zone, and a Soviet zone. The Soviet zone would become known as East Germany. And it even applied to the city of Berlin itself, which was the capital at that time, and it was also divided into 4 areas. So the bipolar war, the Cold War is a bipolar world. The Cold War describes the tense relationship that existed between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other hand, following World War II and continuing until 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In other words, this bipolar world, this, Soviet Union allies and its allies versus U.S. and its allies, pitted the principles of democracy and free market economies on the one hand against the system of communism and its planned command economies on the other hand. The tense and insecure international order managed to avoid major confrontations of the size or scale of another world war. Nevertheless, it was a Cold War. It may not have heated up to a world war, but it was a Cold War and very tense. As Winston Churchill so eloquently yet realistically stated in a 1946 speech at Fulton, Missouri, an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. Nevertheless, mounting anxieties were ventilated through three principal avenues. One was a buildup of nuclear forces by each side in an unprecedented militarization on a global scale. The second was what we might call close calls, frightening yet peacefully resolved powder kegs, that is, potentially explosive international incidents which brought the world to a brink of nuclear holocaust. And third, the policy of containment, reaching its climax in the eruption of contained conflicts, utilizing conventional, that is, non-nuclear forces. In 1945, as we said, the United Nations was established. And in 1948, the Marshall Plan, its official name being the European Recovery Program, officially began. The Marshall Plan of the United States offered economic assistance to rebuild war-torn Western Europe. Although not originally conceived as such, the Marshall Plan was, by the time of its implementation, an instrument of the Cold War, designed partly to keep Western European nations from sinking economically, because if they sank economically, that in turn could threaten the foundations of democracy. In 1949, the U.S. and its European allies founded a military alliance which still exists today called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 6 years later, the Soviet Union and its East European satellites, called the Eastern Bloc states, also created a military alliance and called it the Warsaw Pact. Well, how does the Cold War end? Again, we're looking at the overview, and we'll look at specific instances of the Cold War here in a minute. Détente is a French word meaning relaxation or easing. In the political sense, it has been used to describe the relaxation of Cold War tensions between the superpowers of the USA and the USSR. In 1972, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT Treaty, was signed between the United States and the Soviet Union, whereby the two superpowers ended the building of ICBMs. ICBMs are intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they also agreed to limit their number of nuclear submarines and ABMs, that is, anti-ballistic missiles. In the same year, as we've already pointed out last week, U.S. President Richard Nixon visited the People's Republic of China. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev began to support reforms, referred to collectively under the categories of glasnost, that is openness, which was cultural exchanges, and perestroika, economic restructuring. In 1989, communism collapsed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. And on November 9th, 1989, on a very historic occasion, the Berlin Wall was opened. No one of my age would ever have thought that the Berlin Wall would fall, that there would be a unification, as there was in 1990, of East and West Germany, and that communism would collapse in the Soviet Union and a Russian Federation would form. All of these things seem to be something that was unfathomed, and partly came about because this Cold War had led to such a military-based economy that was sapping the resources of the USSR. And its domestic economy likewise suffered in trying to keep up with the United States in the Cold War and in the military buildup. When the USSR told many of its Eastern Bloc states, that is those in Eastern Europe, that it was going to withdraw a lot of foreign aid, it began the process of one domino toppling after another. In 1992, Czechoslovakia peacefully split into two nations, which we have currently, Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Okay, I want to tell you a little anecdote. There was a pastor, a Lutheran pastor, in Eastern Germany by the name of Uwe Holmer. And in January of 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Erich Honecker, who was the brutal and hated dictator of Eastern Germany, found himself sick and homeless. And he was so despised that he could not find shelter anywhere. And so some people finally contacted Pastor Uwe Holmer, who ran a church-run convalescent center. And Pastor Holmer had bitter memories of Erich Honecker. I mean, Honecker was the one who had presided over the building of the wall between Eastern and Western Germany, and that prevented Holmer from seeing his family on the other side of the wall. It kept him from even attending his own father's funeral. And he really resented Honecker's wife, Margot Honecker, because she had been the operator of the East German Ministry of Education. And Holmer had 10 children, and none of them were admitted to any university in East Germany because they were of the Lutheran faith and they were practicing Lutherans. And the East German regime was atheistic. Nonetheless, despite all of this, Holmer agreed to take care of Honecker under his own roof, saying that forgiveness was something important. Indeed, the world itself today is a world that is stricken by a lot of painful memories. We're going to be discussing many of those painful memories which persist of horrendous things that happen. And it seems that in such a manner, if we are to move forward, that the ideas of forgiveness shown by Pastor Holmer might be a useful thing indeed. So what we're going to do now is turn to the Cold War and Central America. And this gives you a little map of Central America, showing, of course, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and of course you see here as well Cuba. And it's at Cuba where we're going to begin. In 1959, Fidel Castro gained control of Cuba, and 2 years later, in 1961, he declared Cuba a socialist nation. Now, Cuba is very strategically located, 90 miles south of Florida. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, felt that it could not stand this, a socialist nation within 90 miles of U.S., so it planned a secret invasion of Cuba to be staged by CIA-trained Cuban exiles. On April 17th, 1961, 2,000 men landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Within 2 days, the invasion, lacking sufficient air support, had utterly failed. Now, partly in response to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro accepted and approved the installation of Soviet offensive missile sites in Cuba. The United States responded with a naval and air blockade of Cuba in October 1962. Days later, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missile bases. The fact of the matter is, as we now know, since the Soviet Union ended and its archives have been opened up to historians, as one historian claimed, never had the world been brought closer to nuclear war at any time since World War II. Nicaragua is a Central American nation that was ruled for many years by the Somoza family. Opponents to the Somoza family called themselves Sandinistas in honor of Augusto Cesar Sandino, a Nicaraguan rebel who died opposing the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua in the 1920s and 1930s. In 1979, the Sandinistas gained power, and the administration of U.S. President Jimmy Carter recognized them. The U.S. President Ronald Reagan became suspicious of the increasingly leftist Sandinista government, supported monetarily and militarily by the Soviet Union via Cuba. The U.S. imposed economic pressures against the Sandinista government and supported the training and operations of their opponents, the Contras. In 1984, as the atrocities of the Contras gained further attention and as American public support waned, the U.S. Congress, by terms of the Boland Amendment, prohibited further military aid to the Contras. In circumvention of the U.S. Constitution, the National Security Council, with the involvement of U.S. Colonel Oliver North, illegally and covertly supplied the Contras through funds diverted from the sale of arms to Iran. Called the Iran-Contra Affair, these secret arrangements were first exposed in October 1986. The following year, the CIA continued military aid to the Contras, but by 1987-88, the Contras and the Sandinista government began negotiations. In 1990, the Sandinistas and the Contras agreed to a ceasefire, and a new president was elected in internationally supervised elections. Free elections have been held since 1990. El Salvador. A civil war raged in El Salvador in the years 1980 through 1992. This Central American nation was also a victim of civil war, and a politically repressive civilian military junta led by Jose Duarte gained control of the government circa 1980 and fought rebel forces with right-wing death squads, claiming that the leftist guerrillas were communists. Some Roman Catholic leaders, including Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, supported the rebel cause for reform and were brutally murdered. Romero himself was shot while saying Mass in 1980. The guerrilla forces united somewhat under an umbrella organization called the FMLA, named in honor of a Marxist revolutionary who was executed for organizing a peasant uprising in the early 1930s. The U.S. provided economic and military aid to the Salvadoran government, about $3 billion during the 1980s, and supported the election of Jose Duarte as president in 1984. By 1988, the war in El Salvador was in a rough stalemate. Over 60,000 civilian and military personnel had been killed in the struggle, and the standard of living in this tiny, densely populated nation was the lowest of the century. In addition, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees within the nation and probably 1 million emigres who had left the country. In March 1989 elections, Alfredo Cristiani of the right-wing ARENA, the National Republican Alliance Party, was elected president. The new regime proved equally frightening. In November 1989, government forces murdered 6 Jesuit priests. In April 1990, under UN auspices, negotiations between the government and the rebels began. And in January 1992, the government and the rebels signed an agreement to end the country's 12 years of civil war. The first national elections since the end of the Civil War were held in March 1994. Grenada. In 1979, a communist leader, Maurice Bishop, staged a coup in Grenada, becoming premier. In 1983, Maurice Bishop was unseated by another communist coup and eventually executed. U.S. President Ronald Reagan, claiming a vital interest in the area, sent U.S. troops to Grenada in October 1983, and following 2 days of fighting, the communists fell from power. Well, what about the Cold War and Asia? During World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union had sent troops to Korea against the Japanese. After the war, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, seen here, with Soviet troops occupying the north and American troops the south. A communist government formed in North Korea, and a pro-Western government was created in South Korea. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States sent troops to support South Korea, and the subsequent war became an essential stalemate. In 1953, an armistice was signed. The resulting truce line, or armistice line, as you can see here, became the border between North and South Korea. North Korea remains a repressive regime with the fourth largest army in the world and a nuclear weapons program. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Cold War and Southeast Asia, namely Vietnam. French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, this was a colonial possession of France. After World War II, in 1946, Ho Chi Minh, a communist, began to harass the French in Vietnam. He and his communist rebels were known as the Viet Minh. In 1954, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French surrendered, and at a subsequent conference at Geneva, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. And, of course, the United States became involved on the part of providing France initially with advisors and then kept escalating the number of troops, seeing this again as a struggle against communism. The war in Vietnam lasted until 1975 when U.S. troops left and the country was reunited. In China, we show here a photograph of the Dalai Lama, and we also want to discuss a little bit about Tibet. The Dalai Lama is the fourth Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism. He was born in 1935. In 1950, China invaded Tibet. In 1956, rebellion broke out in Tibet over land redistribution and other Chinese-led initiatives. By 1959, China had crushed this rebellion, and the Dalai Lama fled to India, where he established a Tibetan government in exile. In 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 2008, a new rebellion broke out in Tibet. Now, a very confusing area are the Balkan states. These are countries occupying the Balkan Peninsula, which lies between the Adriatic and Ionian Seas to the west, the Mediterranean Sea to the south, and the Aegean and Black Seas to the east. These states include Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, and the former Yugoslavia. Now, before World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the Habsburgs ruled Slovenia and Croatia. This explains why these areas are predominantly Roman Catholic. In 1908, as you'll remember, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, a transition zone with a mixed population of Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims. The Byzantine Empire and then the Ottoman Empire ruled Serbia and the southern provinces. This explains why these areas are predominantly Orthodox Christians and Muslim. In World War I, we've already discussed this, in 1914, The Austrian emperor's nephew and heir, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, and his wife were killed by Serbian nationalists. And you know the rest of the story. World War I occurred. At the end of World War I, Yugoslavia was created, and the Serbs dominated the new nation of Yugoslavia. World War II, the Nazis occupied Croatia and Serbia. And this shows you a little bit about what we're going to discuss here in a minute, the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991, which yielded a new patchwork of nation states. So you have Slovenia up here in the north, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's Sarajevo, Montenegro, Serbia over here, and Macedonia. The Cold War. Yugoslavia became a communist nation after World War II, headed by Marshal Josip Tito. Tito died in 1980. The end of the Cold War. Communism fell in Yugoslavia in 1989, and Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, on the pretext of protecting Serbs, invaded Kosovo. By 1991, Yugoslavia broke up into separate nations. And during the 1990s, ethnic warfare based upon Serbian nationalism spread to Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, resulting in genocide. In 1994, NATO went to war for the first time in its almost half-century of existence to bring a halt to the hostilities in the former Yugoslavia. In 1995, in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, ending the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 2000, Serbian President Milosevic was defeated in elections, but he refused to accept the results. Demonstrations, protests ensued. Finally, Milosevic resigned, and he was extradited to a UN tribunal in The Hague in the Netherlands for trial for war crimes. The trial began in February 2002. He died of a heart attack in 2006 before there was a verdict. In 2002, the former nation of Yugoslavia officially became known as Serbia and not Montenegro. And in 2003, the EU assumed peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina from NATO, and Kosovo declared its independence by 2008. And we'll continue this discussion in part 2. Thank you, and have a good day.